Now, this is exactly the moment they said would never come. Because here's where it lands. Christopher Blake Griffith walked up to a TMZ camera, looked into the lens like a man who had been rehearsing this exact instant for months, and calmly, surgically, professionally, took the whole Stefon Diggs narrative and dismantled it in front of the entire internet. If you have been following this saga since the spring, if you have been watching Cardi B stand next to a man the internet has been begging her to step away from, and if you have been waiting for the moment somebody, anybody, would finally cut through the noise, well, that moment landed this week. Boost the signal, hype the reply, and drop a comment before we even get started, because what Christopher Blake just did on that sidewalk deserves the full circulation. 1 like counts as a receipt. 2 likes counts as a subpoena. Let's roll into it, because Cardi B is not going to like what comes next. Here's the first thing you need to understand. The prevailing story that Stefon Diggs has been quietly feeding, through friends, through leaks, through the polite little whispers that get passed to bloggers with a wink and a payment, is that Christopher Blake Griffith is a con artist. That is the pitch. That is the frame. That is the entire architecture of the defense, that Christopher stole something from Stefon, Stefon caught him, and now Christopher, in a desperate rebound move, has invented a sexual assault allegation as a cash grab. That is what they want you to believe. That is the narrative they have been rehearsing for months. Cardi B, unfortunately, decided to co-sign that narrative in front of millions of people who had already made up their minds otherwise. And that is why we are here today. Because Christopher Blake walked outside, cameras rolling, and did the one thing that shatters that entire manufactured frame. He spoke. Calmly. Clearly. Without a shake in his voice, without a stumble, without a single stammer that would betray the profile of a man running a con. If you have watched enough of these interviews across enough of these celebrity litigation stories, you already know what I mean. The liars stammer. The liars over-explain. The liars fill every silence with 3 more sentences than the question required. Christopher did none of that. He answered every question with the same quiet composure of a man who has already sat with his lawyers, already reviewed the calendar, already counted every single receipt, and is waiting for the courtroom to arrive. And that composure, right there, is the receipt. That composure is the paper trail before the paperwork gets filed. That composure is a man who already knows the ending of the movie and is waiting patiently for the rest of us to catch up. Here's the moment that snapped the internet's spine. The TMZ reporter asked Christopher about Cardi B. And Christopher, without hesitation, said the sentence that has been echoing across every comment section for the last 72 hours. He said, in effect, that a liar told her a lie, and she believed it. That was it. 1 sentence. No shouting. No dramatics. No performance. Just a clean, surgical observation about the woman who decided to insert herself into a legal matter she had no reason to touch. And then Christopher went further. Because Christopher Blake pointed at the one detail that Cardi B's team apparently forgot to prepare her for. Christopher pointed at the trail. Christopher pointed at the paternity. Christopher pointed at the plethora, that was his exact word, plethora, of children born last year all carrying the surname Diggs. And Christopher asked the question everyone at home has been asking. Would a woman like Cardi B, a woman who has publicly built her brand on protecting her own children, knowingly sign up for the man attached to that trail? Christopher's answer, on camera, was no. Christopher's suggestion, on camera, was that Stefon Diggs has been lying to Cardi B in the exact same posture that Stefon Diggs has been lying to the public, and Cardi B, whether she wanted to hear it or not, is now standing on the wrong side of a story that has already been written. Now, before we go any further, understand the machinery that is trying to bury this whole story. There is a coordinated push, and it is not subtle. Bird Nation, the loyal foot soldiers on both sides of Cardi and Diggs, have been marching in formation across every timeline. Every reply thread, every quote tweet, every duet video is running the same playbook. Christopher Blake is a serial grifter. Christopher Blake has done this before. Christopher Blake is a professional accuser. That is the wall they are building. And I have to tell you, I have watched this particular wall get built around men and women in the celebrity industrial complex for years, and every single time, the wall has cracks. Because the wall is not built of evidence. The wall is built of vibes. And vibes do not survive a deposition. Vibes do not survive a discovery motion. Vibes do not survive a subpoena. Vibes evaporate the second a bailiff calls the room to order, and Bird Nation is about to learn that lesson the expensive way. Here's the twist. Here's the con. And here's the part that Cardi B and her handlers apparently did not stress test before Cardi picked up her phone and typed her opinion into the record. If Christopher Blake Griffith is a professional grifter, if that is truly the profile, then explain the settlement. Explain, on the record, the hotel that already paid out. Explain the video evidence. Explain the 2 separate physical incidents that are already documented, already timestamped, already sitting in a case file with a judge's name printed at the top. Because the story that Bird Nation is running requires all of that evidence to simply not exist. And it does exist. It exists in filings. It exists in security footage. It exists in the closed-out settlement that the hotel processed quietly, because hotels do not settle with grifters. Hotels settle with liability. And when a hotel settles, that is not a vibe. That is a paper trail. That is corporate risk management. That is a legal department, staffed with attorneys who bill by the 6-minute increment, looking at the exposure and choosing to pay rather than argue. And corporate legal departments do not pay unless the exposure is real. So here's where we are. Christopher Blake spoke, and every single line Christopher delivered landed with the same weight. Christopher was asked about coming back from the friendship with Diggs. Christopher said, in effect, that Christopher had already tried to hand Stefon Diggs a pass a couple of years ago, on the assumption that Stefon would apologize and move on. Stefon, according to Christopher, did the opposite. Stefon told Christopher, in Christopher's own words, to kiss his backside. And that is why the litigation exists. That is why the courtroom is coming. That is why Christopher, on that sidewalk, said the phrase that should be the epitaph on this entire chapter. Christopher said somebody has got to pay, and Christopher was not talking about money. Christopher said justice has to be executed in full form. Christopher said if it is up to Christopher, this case is going in front of a judge and a jury. And when the reporter asked if this was a cash grab, Christopher looked straight into the camera and said the line that Cardi B should have watched 3 times before Cardi posted anything. Christopher said Christopher had never demanded a dollar amount. Not one. Not ever. And the internet caught that sentence and clipped it and looped it and pinned it to the top of every reply chain for a reason. Because a man who is running a cash grab does not, on camera, refuse to name a number. A man running a cash grab lists the number. A man running a cash grab shows the invoice. Christopher did neither. Now, look. On the matter of Cardi B specifically, let's be honest about the position Cardi has put herself in. Cardi B is not a neutral bystander. Cardi B is a woman with a public brand, a very public brand, that runs on the premise of authenticity, street credibility, and the moral high ground of a self-made survivor. That is the brand. That is the business. That is the empire. And Cardi B decided, of her own free will, to walk out onto the field of a legal matter that has nothing to do with Cardi, and vouch for the character of a man whose paternity ledger reads like a phone book. That was Cardi's choice. And now, that choice is doing what choices do, it is compounding. Every hour that Cardi B does not walk that cosign back, the compounding gets worse. Every day that the timeline moves without Cardi issuing a clarification, the ledger of Cardi's own credibility takes another hit. This is not a slow bleed. This is not a small dent. This is a public brand watching its own equity discount in real time because Cardi B decided the alliance mattered more than the audit. Here's the piece the internet has already noticed. Every point Christopher Blake made about why Cardi B should stop talking is a valid one. Every single one. If Stefon Diggs has fathered 5 or 6 children in a compressed window, and the paperwork suggests the number is in that range, then the woman standing beside Stefon is not standing beside a partner. Cardi B is standing beside a pattern. And Cardi B, of all people, should recognize a pattern. Cardi B built an entire origin story on recognizing patterns in men. Cardi B built an entire song catalog on warning women about men exactly like this. And yet, in this specific instance, Cardi B decided that the man in front of Cardi was the exception. Christopher Blake, on camera, pointed at that contradiction with the calm of a man who already knew the internet would do the rest of the work for him. And the internet did. And the internet is still doing it. And the internet is going to keep doing it until Cardi B either issues a correction or hires a very expensive crisis firm to help Cardi issue one on Cardi's behalf. Now let me be direct about the deeper hypocrisy layered underneath this whole thing, because this is where it stops being a celebrity feud and starts becoming a case study. Cardi B, by her own admission, on Cardi's own record, in Cardi's own catalog of interviews, has described a past that includes drugging and robbing men. That is on tape. That is on record. That is a page in Cardi's own autobiography. Cardi B, by the standards of the very argument Cardi is now trying to weaponize against Christopher Blake, is exactly the kind of person Cardi is accusing Christopher of being. Cardi is the professional profile. Cardi is the pattern. And yet Cardi B has decided that when Cardi did it, it was hustle, but when Christopher is accused of it, it is fraud. That is not a moral framework. That is a double standard printed on glossy paper. That is a rulebook where the rules apply to everyone in the room except the person holding the rulebook. That is exactly the kind of framework the audience notices in the first 10 seconds of a story like this, which is precisely why Cardi B has been getting ratioed on every single post Cardi has made since Sunday. And Christopher, to Christopher's credit, has never once weaponized any of that. Christopher has stayed on the specific matter of Stefon Diggs. Christopher has stayed on the specific matter of the incident. Christopher has kept the scope narrow, the language surgical, and the tone calm. Which, again, is not the profile of a con artist. Con artists sprawl. Con artists inflate. Con artists cannot help but stretch the frame to cover more ground than the evidence supports. Christopher has done the opposite. Christopher has narrowed. Christopher has pointed at one date, one address, one incident, Los Angeles, May 29th, Christopher's residence, and refused to move off that spot no matter how many hands tried to pull Christopher off of it. That is the discipline of a man with a case. That is the discipline of a man with counsel. That is the discipline of a man who has been coached, correctly, to stay on the fact pattern and let everybody else do the yelling. And the yelling, of course, has been plentiful. Here's where this becomes bigger than Stefon Diggs. Because on the matter of Stefon Diggs himself, the paper trail is not just embarrassing. The paper trail is damning. Stefon Diggs is a man who was sued by a woman in the woman's first trimester of pregnancy, and Stefon Diggs used that lawsuit as evidence that the child was not Stefon's, until the paternity test came back, and then, suddenly, Stefon Diggs was posting photographs. Suddenly, Stefon Diggs was the proud father. Suddenly, Stefon Diggs was the man in the highlight reel. That is not a partner. That is not a father. That is a public relations department wearing the costume of a family man. And when a man will deny a child until the science forces the man to accept the child, that man will deny anything. That man will deny an incident. That man will deny a friendship. That man will deny a room. That man will deny a date on a calendar. Because a man who denies a child has already told you the ceiling of what the man is willing to deny. And Stefon Diggs, publicly, has raised that ceiling higher than most professional athletes in Stefon's tax bracket would dare to. Now, before we roll into the closing lap of this thing, understand what the courtroom is going to look like. Because Christopher Blake, on that sidewalk, told you exactly what Christopher wants. Christopher wants a judge. Christopher wants a jury. Christopher wants the record. Christopher wants the transcript. Christopher wants the deposition. Christopher wants 12 strangers to sit in a room and listen to the entire timeline in sequence. And that should terrify the Diggs camp. That should terrify Bird Nation. Because everything Bird Nation has been built for the timeline, for the retweet, for the reply. None of it has been built for a courtroom. A courtroom does not care about vibes. A courtroom does not care about which fanbase yelled the loudest. A courtroom asks for the receipts, and Christopher Blake has been walking around with a folder of receipts under Christopher's arm for the entire year. And Stefon Diggs, in that same courtroom, is going to have to explain, under oath, every single item in that folder. Under oath. Under penalty of perjury. In front of a court reporter whose only job is to type it down word for the appellate record. Here is the twist the Diggs defenders keep missing. Even if you strip out Christopher Blake entirely, even if you pretend for a moment that Christopher's allegation does not exist, Stefon Diggs still has the paternity ledger. Stefon Diggs still has the denials. Stefon Diggs still has the abandoned postpartum accusations. Stefon Diggs still has the public record of behavior that would make any reasonable person raise an eyebrow. The Christopher Blake case is not the beginning of the story. The Christopher Blake case is the crescendo. Because the story about Stefon Diggs has been consistent for years, and the story about Christopher Blake, in comparison, has been consistent for months. Two consistent stories, running in opposite directions, are about to collide inside a Los Angeles courtroom, and only one of them has the paper trail on its side. Only one of them has the settlement. Only one of them has the security footage. Only one of them has the calm cadence of a man who is already answering the questions the same way he intends to answer them under oath. Now, on the matter of the internet, the comment section under the TMZ clip has already delivered its verdict. And the verdict is not close. The overwhelming consensus, across every corner of the reply thread, is that Christopher Blake Griffith carries himself like a man telling the truth. Christopher is articulate. Christopher is measured. Christopher is composed. Christopher is, by every visible metric, the calm center of a very loud room. And Cardi B, by contrast, is the loud energy in a room that did not need Cardi's voice. That is the read the internet has landed on. And once the internet lands on a read, the internet does not move. The internet moved on Cardi B this week, and Cardi B has not yet realized that the ground shifted underneath her. That is the most dangerous position a public figure can occupy, the position of being wrong in public while acting as if nothing has changed. Because the audience notices. The audience always notices. The audience is noticing right now, on the pinned reply, on the top comment, on the quote tweet with 100,000 likes. This is the piece that should terrify Cardi's team. Because Cardi B's entire public brand relies on the assumption that the internet is with Cardi. Cardi B has built Cardi's career on the read of the room. Cardi B has always known which way the audience was leaning, and Cardi has always leaned with them. This is the first major misread. This is the first major misalignment. And it is happening in real time, in front of everyone, while the woman herself continues to post as if the tide were still moving Cardi's direction. It is not. The tide reversed on Sunday. The tide reversed the second Christopher Blake finished Christopher's TMZ segment. And every additional post from Cardi B since then has been a woman waving at a boat that has already left the dock. That is a costly image. That is a costly optic. That is the kind of optic that shows up in the next endorsement negotiation, in the next brand deal, in the next headline that is written about Cardi's Q4 numbers. It compounds. It always compounds. Now, let me name the mechanism that is running underneath this entire thing, because it is the mechanism that repeats across every celebrity litigation story we have watched in the last decade. Call it Cardi Diggs denial syndrome. The pattern is simple. A public figure protects another public figure not because they believe the evidence, but because they cannot afford, in brand terms, to break with the alliance. Cardi B is not defending Stefon Diggs because Cardi B has reviewed the case file. Cardi B is defending Stefon Diggs because breaking with Stefon would require Cardi to admit that Cardi was wrong, and the brand Cardi B has built cannot survive the admission of being wrong. So the defense continues. The posts continue. The alliance continues. And the case file, quietly, keeps growing. And this is exactly how these stories always end. The public figure who chose the alliance over the audit ends up losing both, because Stefon Diggs is not going to protect Cardi B in the courtroom, and the audience is not going to protect Cardi B in the endorsement meeting. Cardi is going to be standing there, alone, holding a defense Cardi built on the wrong foundation, wondering how Cardi got to a place where nobody in the room is on Cardi's side. Now, let's zoom out for a moment. Because everything we are watching in the Christopher Blake versus Stefon Diggs situation is not an isolated event. This is a genre. This is a category. This is a repeating pattern in the celebrity litigation universe, and if you have been paying attention for the last 5 years, you already know the shape of it. Powerful figure gets accused. Powerful figure's fan base circles the wagons. Powerful figure's celebrity friends co-sign. And then, months later, the paperwork lands. And the paperwork always lands. That is the one rule of these cases that never breaks. The paperwork always lands, and the co-signers always regret the co-sign. Kevin Hart learned it. Tory Lanez supporters learned it. The list is long, and Cardi B just added Cardi's name to the bottom of that list this week, in real time, in front of a public that has seen this exact sequence play out enough times to know exactly what happens next. And on the matter of Christopher Blake being accused of doing this before to other celebrities, sure. Let's take that argument at face value for 1 second. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that Christopher has been in similar disputes before. Even if that is true, the specific case that is in front of the specific court, with the specific date, at the specific address in Los Angeles on May 29th, has to be adjudicated on the specific facts of that specific case. That is how the legal system works. That is not how the timeline works, but that is how the courtroom works. And Christopher Blake, notably, has never once run from the courtroom. Christopher has been the person begging for the courtroom. Christopher has been the person on camera saying Christopher wants a judge and a jury. That is not the posture of a serial grifter. Serial grifters avoid courtrooms. Serial grifters settle quietly. Serial grifters take the check and move on. Christopher has done the opposite of all three. Here is the closer, and this is the part that Cardi B's team and Stefon Diggs' team need to hear clearly, because both camps have been operating on the assumption that time is on their side. Time is not on their side. Every additional week that passes, Christopher Blake gains ground in the court of public opinion. Every additional week that passes, more filings become public. Every additional week that passes, the settlement precedent from the hotel gets referenced in more legal commentary, more podcasts, more explainer videos, more comment sections. This is a snowball problem. This is a compounding problem. This is the exact kind of story that starts as a footnote and ends as a chapter. And Cardi B, whether Cardi realizes it or not, has attached her name to the chapter. Cardi has attached her brand to the chapter. Cardi has attached Cardi's entire moral posture to the chapter. And when the chapter closes, the person whose name is on the wrong side of the ledger becomes the footnote in somebody else's story. Christopher Blake Griffith did not walk up to that TMZ camera to beg. Christopher did not walk up to plead. Christopher did not walk up to perform. Christopher walked up to file, on the public record, the exact sentences Christopher intends to repeat under oath. That is why the internet is not letting this one go. That is why every corner of the comment section is running the same read. That is why every Cardi B post since Sunday has been ratioed into the ground. Because the audience already knows how this story ends. The audience already knows who has the paper trail. The audience already knows who is calm and who is scrambling. And the audience already knows what happens next, when the courtroom opens its doors and the deposition begins and the 12 strangers walk into the jury box and sit down and start reading. The curtain drops itself. Justice for CB, as the reporter on the scene said, and that phrase has already spread across the comment section like it was engraved there. So, before we roll this thing to a close, tell me. Tell me where you land. Tell me whether you think Cardi B is going to walk this defense back before the trial begins, or whether Cardi is going to double down and go all the way to the bottom of the hole Cardi is currently digging. Tell me whether you think Stefon Diggs settles this quietly before the deposition, or whether Stefon lets the whole thing play out in open court. Tell me whether you think Christopher Blake Griffith is exactly who Christopher says Christopher is, or whether you think there is more to the story we have not seen yet. Tell me whether Bird Nation folds the second the first witness takes the stand, or whether they somehow keep marching after the paperwork lands. Drop it in the comments, because the comment section is where this case is being litigated in real time, and I read every single one of them. Boost the signal, hit the subscribe, and if you have not already caught the earlier breakdown on the Cardi B pregnancy timeline and how it maps against the Diggs paternity ledger, that one is queued up next, and it fills in every single blank this story just opened. See you in the next one.